E. Okay. You boys keep the chatter down. Amen, Brother Gunny, Mark answered. The two men talked more about their families and what they thought this crisis would bring to the country and their little corner of it, of how nothing would ever be the same as it was, and how that could either be good or bad. Gradually the talk died down, and Mark was left to think about things that were troubling him. First and foremost was his family. If only Mike had left the route in the cache, he would be able to find them, but Mark understood why he didn't do it. If anyone saw him bury the barrels, or somehow found the route, they would figure they took the best stuff with them, and they might be willing to track them down and kill them for it. His second biggest concern was now Ed. He was glad the guy had stopped being a weenie, but he didn't quite know how he should handle what he had become. Mark wasn't really upset that he'd killed the last MZB. The asshole had it coming for sure. But if Ed couldn't go along with group decisions, that might cause a major problem down the road. Mark certainly didn't want it to turn into a John situation. He would have to heed Gunny's advice and find a way to work it out with him. Mark was also a little nervous about all of the stolen property they were carrying. He knew that if he just left it there, most probably another group of MZBs would have ended up with it, but it might be hard to explain to a law enforcement agency, especially if some of it was traceable back to an owner who was taking a premature dirt nap. But obviously the police were not out in abundance. He was also concerned with Ronnie. Would she be like Donna and try to take her own life in her grief, or would she pull through? Mark had to make sure they kept a close eye on her. It was approaching noon, and Mark heard Rob's stomach rumble. The new route was much longer, and they weren't even halfway home with all of the detours. The smaller roads also had more curves in them that caused Scott to have to slow down a lot to check for traps. Mark called on the radio and suggested that Scott stop for lunch at the next place he thought was appropriate. 10 minutes later, the group was standing around warming up some soup on one of the Coleman stoves. Everyone was still a little on the giddy side from the successful raid. Mark asked Manny how Ronnie was doing. He was told that she was crying a lot, but she seemed to be accepting things for the way they were. Everyone ate and took advantage of the stop. Scott was smart enough to realize that since they now had a female with them, they needed a place where everyone could conduct their business in private. He had stopped where there was a thick grove of trees and bushes nearby. Mark checked with Scott on how Ed was doing. He told him that Ed wasn't saying much, but when he did talk, it was about how wrong he had been about everything. Scott felt that he was somewhat withdrawn, but that he would probably be okay. At least he appeared to be warming up a little as the day wore on. After everyone was done eating, they continued on their way. Not long after lunch, Scott came up on a large tree that had been felled across the road. Upon inspection, it was not an ambush point. Manny hypothesized that it was probably just some locals trying to discourage travelers from going past their houses. They plotted a new route and resumed their trek. Chainsaw. Okay. Good time for some Katana Boy 650s, if you don't have a chainsaw. Less than an hour later, they came to a bridge that was out. Again, it was scouted and found to be a benign impediment. The bridge was over a dry creek bed on a gravel road, and the sides of the creek bed weren't very steep. All of the vehicles, except for the Trans Am, could have made it easily through the problem area. Rob was curious about what took the bridge out, since there hadn't been any big rain since the burst. Gunny said that it looked like someone used explosives. He figured they either had some dynamite or made some ANFO, ammonium nitrate fuel oil. They discussed pulling the Pontiac through with a tow strap, but decided that whoever didn't want anyone coming through might have more surprises up the road. Think? And again, they replotted a route and continued on. Each detour was taking them farther and farther out of the way and delaying their arrival home. Mark's leg down to the knee and now his left glute were throbbing unremittingly. There was no position that relieved the pain to any degree. It was, however, keeping him awake, even though he was dog-tired. He had to nudge Rob a few times, as the hot meal, lack of sleep, and gradually warming temperatures were starting to have an effect on the driver. He and Rob cracked the windows a little to let some fresh air into the truck. The convoy had found a way through to the minor highway that they needed to move them mostly south again. Finally, they were making good time. The road traveled through mostly rural farmland and ranches. Houses were few and far between, with long driveways leading up to them. A few of the houses had been burned and others looked deserted. Some were obviously being lived in. They had the gates blocked off in various ways. Cattle guards were removed like they were drawbridges. Otherwise, useless vehicles were blocking driveways. Gates were closed, locked, and reinforced with anything that could be pushed, piled, or stacked in front of them. Some of the properties had guards who were visible, and Mark expected that many had guards who weren't. They were at the bottom of a hill with a long, slow grade up in front of them. Mark saw the Jeep disappear over the top without slowing down. Probably Scott was getting tired and sleepy, too. He was about to call the Jeep on the radio to caution them when he heard gunfire. Mark looked at Rob and saw the man staring back at him with wide eyes. Rob punched the accelerator on the Blazer, and the big truck responded instantly. They were fourth in the line behind the big red Ford diesel and Manny's Suburban that was pulling the trailer. Mark called on the radio to Scott and Ed but got no answer. The firing was increasing in intensity each second. The Blazer rocketed past Manny and then Victor. When they were just below the crest of the hill, Rob slammed on the brakes and stopped the truck. A second later, Jim's truck was right behind them. Rob was out and running toward the top of the hill with his rifle before Mark's injured leg would let him dismount the lifted 4x4. Mark had his FAL in a canvas tool bag of magazines and half hobbled, half ran as quickly as he could behind Rob. Dwight with an AK caught up to him just as they got to the top. Rob was lying on the ground and crawling the last few feet. Mark and Dwight copied him. When Rob got to where he could see, he started pouring fire over the hill. When Mark finally pulled himself up to where he could see, he put a huge knot in the pit of his stomach.